There is an old joke. There is a bear sitting in the zoo, looking enviously at the hippo and grumbling under his nose. It would be such a bread and honey to wrap up. So, forgive the vulgarity, but the UN leadership had exactly that behemoth. As far as the borders of the independent state were concerned, according to the plan of the leaders of the UN, it was supposed to extend to the Caspian Sea and the Caucasus. The wording was as follows: in its foreign policy activities, the Ukrainian state will strive to achieve the borders that are most convenient for defense. Borders that will cover all Ukrainian ethnic lands and will provide it with proper economic self-sufficiency. Simply put, where we want, we will draw the border. And the terror began. For the sake of objectivity, it is impossible not to mention that the Poles really behaved towards Ukrainians and Belarusians, who made up 40% of the population of Poland, like real colonizers. It became so much a habit that even in September of 1939, when both the government and the high military command fled from Poland, Soviet units that entered western Ukraine stumbled upon a Polish military unit that, instead of a war with the Germans, pacified another Ukrainian village, shooting to kill with might and main, killing, among other things, 2 teenagers. However, all this does not justify the subsequent massacre of the peaceful Polish population, including women, the elderly and children, arranged by the UN. In 1930, the UN staged a series of arson attacks on Polish farms in Galicia. They have committed about 60 terrorist acts in 10 years. The most notorious was the murder in 1934 of the Polish Minister of Internal Affairs Pirotski, after which the Polish Special Services began to catch the UN en masse, and Czechoslovakia, having arrested all the UN identified on its territory, handed them over to Poland, although relations with both states have always been tense. Those who remained at large did not let up. To replenish the treasury, banks were robbed from the savings bank. They shot not only at the damn Laics, but also at those Ukrainians who were proclaimed national traitors. At that time, there was a movement for the so-called Polish-Ukrainian Compromise, that is, broad autonomy of Ukrainian lands within Poland. The UN members were categorically not satisfied with this trend, and they killed. The victims of the terrorists were the Polish politician Tadeusz Gołówko and the Ukrainian writer Sidor Kolbov, and the famous Ukrainian teacher and educator, director of the academic gymnasium in Lviv, Ivan Babich, supporters of compromise. Over time, Soviet foreign intelligence also joined the fight against the UN. In 1933, UN militants staged a raid on the Soviet consulate in Lviv, in protest against the notorious Holodomor, allegedly staged by evil Muscovites in order to starve out more Ukrainians. By the way, I just committed a crime. According to current Ukrainian laws, denial of the Holodomor is considered a criminal offense. I'll get over it somehow. During the raid, an employee of the consulate Malev was killed, and another Soviet diplomat was wounded. In 1938 in Rotterdam, when Konovalets was sitting at a table in a street cafe, he was met by a contact, who had just arrived from Ukraine, and was recommended to Konovalets by his fellow fighters. In fact, it was the famous leader as of the secret war, Pavel Sudoplatov, by the way, half Ukrainian. It was at that time that young Pavel presented the head of the UN with a box of expensive chocolates. Konovalets loved them. He had such a little weakness. Then he said goodbye. Placing the box in front of him, terrorist number 1 began to eat candy. The trick here was that the bomb embedded in the box was triggered half an hour after the box was moved from a vertical position to a horizontal one, so that the donor had time to leave. Naturally, Sudoplatov carried the box in his jacket pocket strictly vertically. Yes, there are sweets. Konovalets did not have time. The bomb went off. Then European newspapers gave 3 versions of the murder, either the Reds, or a rival Ukrainian group, or the Poles in retaliation for all the terrorist attacks. The NFT, as it should, kept quiet modestly, so that the death of Konovalets remained a mystery for a long time. By that time, the UN was again on the Abwehr's payroll, after a 4-year cooling, which occurred due to the fact that in 1934, the Germans, still weak, handed over Nikolai Lebod, one of the participants in the pirate murder, to Poland. And then, having turned out to be great pragmatists, the OUN people reconciled with the Germans. Hitler was gaining strength, and the money from the Abwehr went serious. By the way, Colonel Lehusen, who served in the Austrian Special Services before the Anschluss, supervised the OUN members in the Abwehr. It is quite possible that some of the OUN members were still old Austrian connections of Lehusen. After the death of Konovalets, the UN was led for some time by an unremarkable trio of minor figures, but in August of 1939 Colonel Melnik became the head of the organization. Soon the UN, as often happens with similar organizations, split in two. The fact is that the ambitious young Stepan Bandera also claimed the general leadership. But both he and his most prominent and active supporters were in Polish prisons and camps at the time when Melnik was elected as a Pacan. The Germans who came to Poland quickly freed this useful audience for themselves, and the young wolves rushed to fight with the old Akela, that is, the miller. Well, it split into Bandera and Melnikovites, which division still exists among the successors of the UN cause. As usual, mutual murderous accusations were quickly launched. Bandera accused Melnikovites of passivity and pandering to former Polish agents, and those, in turn, completely in the Soviet manner, sowed Bandera insubordination to the leadership and the split of the party. OUN-B and OUN-M have been feuding ever since, right up to shooting in the back of the opponents. The ideology of both movements remained the same. You give an independent Ukraine, in the struggle for which all means are good, unless the Melnikovites had more intellectuals, and the Bandera people had more ordinary people. And Bandera had a clear numerical superiority. 2/3 of the OUN members went to him. It should also be noted that the main base for both was Galicia. In Volhynia, the OUN people were supported by much fewer Ukrainians, who lived quite peacefully with numerous Poles there, and the Transcarpathian Russians did not support the UN people at all, since they did not consider themselves Ukrainians. According to Bandera, the whole company went out of step, and he was the only one walking in step. The UN has officially declared that it will fight against almost all other parties, groups and trends, petty bourgeois Melnikovites, hetmans, and supporters of the late Petliura, in general, against all those who continue the work of the upper, as well as social revolutionaries, people's democrats, radicals, Catholic clerics. In general, there are only enemies around, not revolutionaries, opportunists, Freemasons, and even masked Moscow imperialists. They are agents of the Bolsheviks. With the beginning of the Patriotic War, all this audience perked up. In a German wagon train, both OUN moved to the east to liberate Ukraine from the Muscovite Bolshevik and Lyakojuk gangs, as both of them wrote with charming directness in their leaflets. The Bandera Abwehr Battalion Nachtigall, which entered Lviv together with the Wehrmacht in a few days, slaughtered many representatives of the Polish intellectual elite who fled to the USSR from the Germans, among whom there were many scientists and writers with European names. Later, the undefenders will blame everything on a certain special command of the South Dakota. Well, at the same time, Jews were also slaughtered, just for being Jews. The Germans, who drove their Jews into concentration camps and set the task of completely exterminating the Polish-educated stratum, looked at this massacre from the outside with full approval. It was even more convenient for them. They did not commit atrocities, but savage Ukrainians. However, soon the Germans grinned. The Bandera people who broke away from reality hung yellow-blue flags in Lviv and announced the creation of an independent Ukrainian state that would be an equal ally of Great Germany. The Germans, after all, did not need equal allies at all. They immediately stripped the flags, annulled the power, kicked Bandera out of the radio station occupied by them, with the help of which they managed to declare independence to the whole world. Bandera tried to protest timidly, but the Germans quickly sent him to the Sachsenhausen concentration camp, God forbid, not in a common barrack with ifshami and beatings of the capo. There was a kind of VIP zone in the camp, where many prominent politicians from the countries occupied by the Germans were kept in relatively comfortable conditions, just in case they might come in handy on the farm. Only after that, when it became clear to the dumbest that there would be no equal alliance with him by the Chuks, the Bandera part of the OUN indicated some anti-German attitude. Some of its detachments, indeed, sometimes staged extremely sluggish operations against the German army, but very often, if they did not cooperate openly with the Germans, they kept neutrality. The main target was the aliens: Russians, Poles, Jews, and Ukrainians, who sold themselves to Muscovites. It was the Banderites who staged the Volhynia massacre, when at least 100,000 Poles died. Entire villages were cut clean, from infants to the elderly. If the family turned out to be mixed, which is not uncommon in Volhynia, a Ukrainian husband or a Ukrainian wife was also killed, so as not to desecrate racial purity. Bandera fiercely fought against any partisans, and the pro-Soviet Polish Guard Ludova, and oriented towards London and the emigrant government of the regional army there, and against Soviet detachments, and against ethnic Ukrainians Bulbash. It is worth talking about the latter in more detail, since they are little known to us. This movement was led by Taras Borovets, who took, as they said then, the pseudo-Taras Bulba. He also dreamed of independent Ukraine, but was a supporter of the upper government in exile, which, from the point of view of Bandera, was considered a mortal sin. At first, as a true independent artist, he cooperated with the Germans, but already in 1941 year, he moved away from the Germans. Perhaps you can't call him a dashing warrior. Basically, the chieftain was limited to taking away the loot from the Germans from the peasants, returning something to the owners, keeping something for himself. Yes, he sometimes carried out operations against the occupation administration of Ukrainians and Poles. I also tried not to bully the Muscovites too much. There were skirmishes, but most often Borovets Bulba kept armed neutrality with the Reds. His army was not so numerous. His rather original order has been preserved, not to mess with large detachments of Reds, but to disarm a small one, beat the muzzle and let go. Radio messages of partisans who complained to Moscow about disarmament and bruising have also been preserved. In 1943 year, Bandera seized Borovets' wife, a Czech by nationality, and after torture they killed her. Borovets himself eventually swung to the Germans, briefly sat with them in the same department of Sachsenhausen, was released, and agreed to lead the so-called Parachute Group or Group B, about 400 Ukrainian militants, whom the Germans were going to parachute into the Soviet rear. This event was scheduled for April 1945 year, but by that time, things were already going so badly for the Germans that they abandoned this idea. After the war, Borovets moved to the United States and died of natural causes in New York in 1981 year, being 73 years old. As for the Melnikovites, they served the Germans from the very beginning, and they continued. In general, it is best to give a couple of purely German testimonies about the activities of independent artists. The Ukrainian Liberation Army, the UPA, which directed its weapons against the advancing Red Army, in the same way as against the German civil administration in the countryside. She did not fight against the German army. Bratig, an employee of the Ministry of Eastern Territories Affairs. The Ukrainian militia, Bandera members do not cease to desecrate, mock, kill. The Ukrainian burgomasters and the police commandant were brought to justice by the Germans for statements hostile to the Germans, non-fulfillment of German orders, tearing up German passports. Poles are equated by Bandera with Jews, and they are being asked to wear armbands on their sleeves. In many cities, the Ukrainian police have created such units as the Ukrainian Security Service, the Ukrainian Gestapo, and so on. Local and field German commandants partially disarm the militia. Posters are being delivered from Lviv, the content of which states that a free and independent Ukraine should arise under the leadership of the OUN, with the motto Ukraine by Ukrainian, from a report to Berlin by the head of the South Dakota Security Police. As we can see, the struggle against the Germans, which the ideological heirs of Bandera now like to rest on, little resembled a serious armed struggle. By this time, the Ukrainian SS Division Galicia had already been created, which again does not have any military achievements. Whenever she found herself on the Soviet-German front, she was mercilessly beaten. There were also enough Ukrainian police battalions that had already served directly in Great Germany. The Belarusian village of Katyn, and not only it, was burned clean, and its inhabitants were exterminated not by abstract German punishers, but by Ukrainian policemen. Of course, under the supervision and guidance of German commanders, who did not particularly trust racially inferior lackeys. When the Germans were finally kicked out of Soviet Ukraine, the Ukrainian insurgent army of the UPA, mentioned in the German report, continued the fight against the Muscovite occupiers. After the defeat of the Millennial Reich and the surrender of Germany, Bandera replaced the German masters with Anglo-American ones, but continued the struggle with the same zeal and the same methods. It often came down to the fact that whole families were massacred by the regime's henchmen, mostly innocent workers of party and Soviet institutions, teachers, doctors, agronomists, members of cultural and educational groups, Muscovite geologists, and even ordinary villages. Not because of the struggle against the Forest Brothers, but simply because they kept neutrality according to the eternal peasant habit. My mother worked in those places as a member of the Komsomol cultural and educational group, so I got an idea of the Bandera people not only from books. It was the Bandera militants who killed the famous Ukrainian writer Yaroslav Galin, an enemy of the self-styled, with a Hutzel hatchet in their own apartment. In history, there are complaints of Bandera that the people, like Skoropadsky at one time, got some kind of wrong one. In the spring of 1944 year, the commander-in-chief of the UPA, and the current national hero of independent Ukraine, Roman Shukovich, said at the OUN training camp near Lviv, "It's too late to talk to the pro-Ukrainian masses. We brought them up badly, beat them a little and hanged them. Now, we need to think about how to preserve the organization and seize power." The organization was preserved, the power was not seized, but a lot of blood was shed. The number of Bandera victims is estimated to be at least 20,000 people. The war went on for a long time. Large UPA gangs were destroyed by 1953 year, small ones lasted until 1956. And the last clash of state security with the Forest Brothers took place in Galicia in 1959 year. Bandera lived abroad for a long time, until he was killed in 1959 year by the liquidator of the KGB. Shukovich was killed in a shootout with MGB officers back in 1950 year. As for the Miller, after the war, he frankly went into circulation. He did not have a serious force, practically did not participate in the movement of the Forest Brothers. The new Anglo-American owners of Bandera, because of his worthlessness, were not interested in the Miller at all and did not give money. So Melnik escaped the scrutiny of the KGB and died a natural death in 1964 year. It should also be mentioned that several thousand members of the UPA operated in Poland until 1947 year, where they even managed to kill the Deputy Minister of Defense of Poland, the famous General Karol Swerczewski. However, it is worth clarifying, this cannot be considered a special merit of Bandera. Everything happened purely by accident. The Forest Brothers ambushed the car with food, but then the general's lone Willis appeared. The truck with his guards got stuck and fell behind. In the same way, 3 years earlier, by pure chance, the commander of the First Ukrainian Front, General Vachutin, who was traveling with a few guards, ran into Bandera and died. In Poland, however, they did away with the UPA earlier than in the USSR. As a result of the population exchange between the two countries in Poland, this is called Operation Vistula. Ethnic Poles were resettled from the Soviet Union to Poland, and ethnic Ukrainians, respectively, were resettled from Poland to the Union, after which the Poles, who remained without any support from the population of the Forest Brothers, were quickly rooted out by the roots. As a curiosity, we can also mention that in 1991 year, when Ukraine really became independent, a particularly stubborn Bandera man appeared, who had been in the underground for almost 40 years. Tellingly, Bandera never, neither during the Patriotic War, nor after, were not declared in the Crimea. Firstly, there was no need to count on any support from the population there, and secondly, there were enough local bastards. But let's take a closer look. No matter how bitter it is to admit, Crimea at one time was formally surrendered to the Germans because of the mediocrity, cowardice, outright meanness of Soviet military leaders. There was no superiority of the Germans in troops and military equipment, which for some time they liked to write about after the war. On the contrary, by June 1942, the defenders of Sevastopol had 47 tanks and 7 armored vehicles, and in the 11th Infantry Division of General Manstein, who broke into the Crimea, there were only 17 tanks, and even then not of their own production, but captured French, plus 4 captured and 2 divisions of self-propelled guns. However, Manstein acted brazenly, audaciously, sometimes openly adventurous. He really wanted to get a field marshal's baton. According to the strict German ordering, the field marshal rank was given, among other things, for the capture of large fortresses, which included Sevastopol. But the Soviet generals and admirals. There are simply no censorship words here. The commander of the Black Sea Fleet, Admiral Oktyabrski, missed a great opportunity to deliver a crushing blow to the Germans moving along the coast. He had at his disposal a battleship, 6 cruisers, dozens of destroyers and gunboats, despite the fact that there were no German warships on the Black Sea at all. Having definitely wavered and decided that Sevastopol could no longer be held, although the chances of the opposite outcome were serious, he began to export most of the artillery ammunition and 2/3 of the anti-aircraft artillery from the Crimea. Then it turned out to be really disgusting. The October and land generals, with a couple of hundred staff officers and senior officers, literally soaked with the consent regulations, simply fled from the Crimea by plane, leaving the command to Major General Petrov. He very quickly left the peninsula on a submarine, handing over command to Major General Novikov. Novikov also quickly escaped from the Crimea on a patrol car with his staff, but he was intercepted by Italian torpedo boats and took everyone prisoner. Left without any command, the Soviet units fought for another 4 days, but then were dispersed and destroyed. What I still can't understand is why none of these runaways were not only leaned against the wall, but also not demoted. They were shot for less. By the way, in the 41st, it was for abandoning the troops entrusted to them and fleeing to the rear that Regimental Commissar Schlensky, who escaped from the front in the Baltic states, was shot, and a little later, the commanders of the 34th Army, Major General Kashanev, and the commander of the artillery of the army, Major General Goncharev, who acted in the same way. And the Germans have a known case when a general went under execution for withdrawing his division without an order. This may not be the only example. I haven't dug very deep. In Crimea, the Germans were even more violent than in other Soviet territories occupied by them. This is not even comparable to the fact that in Belarus, the occupiers took a tax for dogs and cats for every window in the hut. The residents of Kirk were ordered to hand over to the Germans all the food they had, for non-fulfillment, execution. A little later, by another order, the occupiers ordered Kirk residents to immediately register not only working cattle and cows, but also all sheep, chickens, roosters, chickens, turkeys, geese. It was possible to slaughter one's own chicken for food only with the permission of the German commandant, and if it were limited to that. Germans and Romanians, according to reliable data, destroyed up to 50,000 civilians in the Crimea, including women, the elderly, teenagers, and children. 85,500 people were taken to forced labor in Germany. An important clarification: this concerned the vast majority of Russians and Jews, but not the Crimean Tatars, who again, like 90 years ago, saw a chance for themselves. And it's true, at first the Germans gave every reason to think that the Crimean Khanate would almost be reborn. The South Dakota quickly created a kind of self-government bodies. Even the decrepit old man Seda Mehta, once in the distant 18th, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the then Kurultai, was brought from Turkey. And they spread a rumor that they were going to make Sultan Giray, a descendant of the former Gyris, the head of the self-government. Yes, the Crimean Khan, who had not held this post for a long time, in the same 18th year. During the retreat of the Soviet troops from the Crimea, about 20,000 Crimean Tatars deserted. Almost all of the adult Tatar population of Crimea is of military age, and immediately they went to the service of the great leader Adolf Hitler and Fendi, the liberator of all peoples and religions, as the Führer was called by the newspaper of self-government. In this service, they shot Soviet prisoners and civilians, actively acted against the partisans. Other dissidents of a later time claimed that a small part of the Tatars had passed to the Germans, and the rest were partisans. That's just the number of Tatars in the partisan detachments is known for sure. On the 1st of June 1943 year 6, on the 15th of January 1944 year 598, on April 1944 year 391. Not enough compared to the 20,000 who went to serve Hitler. The most interesting thing is that the Germans used Tatar self-government and everything else exclusively as bait for the Turks, to involve them in the war against the USSR. When it became finally clear that Turkey did not risk getting into the war, the Germans, of course, in secret from the Tatars, who could still be useful, began to develop completely different plans. What kind of Crimean Khanate is there? Already in July 1942, Hitler announced at a regular meeting at his headquarters that he intended to completely cleanse the Crimea of Tatars in general of racially inferior population, and populate the peninsula exclusively with German colonists. Where there is a word, there is a deed. At a joint meeting of representatives of the Wehrmacht and the police, who were subordinate to Himmler at that time, specific details of the eviction were already discussed. It was decided to create special camps outside the Crimea for racial survey of the population. These plans were abandoned only because after the Stalingrad disaster, the Germans were no longer up to colonizing the Crimea. When the peninsula was liberated by Soviet troops, some of the Tatars left with the Germans. The first, as is usual in such cases, were the leaders of self-government and other spiritual leaders. A certain number of Tatars became part of the Eastern Turkic SS unit. Some even landed in France for police service in the SS and in the auxiliary air defense forces. It was here in the Kremlin that it was decided to evict all Crimean Tatars from the peninsula and to camps, and not to Siberia, but to sunny Uzbekistan. Only the families of frontline soldiers, partisans, and Tatar women who married Russians were left, and 6,000 Tatars of military age were mobilized into the army. All kinds of dissidents, and this is called Stalin's crime. However, by the standards of that harsh time, he acted quite gently. After all, the alternatives would only be mass shootings. The Nazis, if they had the opportunity, would have acted much tougher. In addition, the migrants were not dragged out of their homes in what they were. They were allowed to take with them personal belongings, clothes, household equipment, dishes, and food in the amount of up to 500 kilograms of the population. On the spot in Uzbekistan, the party leadership was obliged to provide the settlers with household plots, to assist in the construction of houses with local building materials, to allocate loans for the construction of houses, 5,000 rubles per family with installments of up to 7 years. And the first 3 months during the arrangement, you can supply flour, fruits and vegetables for free. During the resettlement, 49 mortars, 173 machine guns, 192 submachine guns, 2,650 rifles, 326,887 cartridges. A large number of facets were seized from the white and fluffy Tatars. There were enough weapons to equip the then rifle division, except without artillery. Actually, it is worth adding that the Crimean Tatars, if you dig deeper, were not evicted, but in fact, returned to their historical homeland. It is now impossible to find exact figures for the prescription of years, but many Tatars of Bachu, who came to the Crimea at one time, or rather to Taurida, were just natives of Uzbekistan. In general, the average time. I wasn't the first to notice. At one time, Poles and Czechs quietly deported their Germans to Germany. But no one thinks of moaning about the bitter fate of the repressed peoples, paying compensation, returning real estate. In the absence of Tatars, the Crimean SS was abolished, and the Crimean region appeared in its place. Naturally, as part of their